Wait for it. Wait for it, and we're live. Hey, all you crazy sci-fi and fantasy fans. It's time for your daily dose of shenanigans over here at the Blasters and Blades podcast. Just a couple of nerdy veterans and one chaos coordinator geeking out over our science fiction passions and fantastical fantasies. A place where magic is king, the sky is the limit, and space is the place. We are the podcast that puts the fun in dysfunction. So without further ado, we're going to get this show started. So first, I know some of you have asked for proof of life of my co-host. I will tell you that we are working on something, but when he's working crazy hours, life happens, border patrol activities. He's told me the hours he's getting paid, and it's physically impossible to work that many hours in a week. So it's government math, people. I don't know what you want from me. And with that, we've got our guest, Mr. Dane Cobain. Could you introduce yourself to our listeners and viewers at home?
Sure. Well, first of all, thanks for having me. I am Dane Cobain. I'm a British writer. I write in a variety of genres. I'm probably mostly known for horror and mystery, but I've done a little bit of everything throughout the years. I also work as a freelance writer, so a lot of that includes sort of ghostwriting for clients as well. Language lover and word nerd, you know the drill really, and big reader as well. So it's a pleasure to be on here chatting to you about books and stuff.
All righty. And the next part of the introduction is where we first found him. And I don't know how he found us, but I think you found us, not the other way around.
I did. It was a recommendation from Jana S. Brown, who
okay.
I'm not sure. Have you had her on in the past, or did you just know
I
each
have.
other?
I'm actually co-writing with her.
Each other.
Yeah, I'm co-writing with her.
Oh, brilliant. Yeah. So, she and I, we used to be coaches together for, again, one of the clients that I do in my freelance business. So we were kind of publishing coaches, helping first-time authors to build a publishing business. And she sort of mentioned that I should get in touch with you because I think the rest of the coaches were more kind of romance sort of themed, right. Whereas I have a bit more in common with you guys. So she said I should reach out, and I did, and here we are.
Yeah, we actually will interview romance authors as long as it's speculative fiction romance. I mean, as long as it's speculative fiction. In fact, some of the guys that listen, their wives have actually said, "Hey, can you talk to us too?" So I'm perfectly willing to talk to romance, even if it's not going to be our highest viewed episodes. They're just less willing to come on the podcast for whatever reason. I think. For maybe it's because pen names and they don't want themselves out there because of what they write romance wise. I honestly don't know. But if they come, we'll have them. So all right.
I'll let them know.
Outstanding. So before we get started, we do have to do the religion question. So are you ready for this? Because there are wrong answers, sir.
Okay. All right.
All right. Star Wars, Star Trek, or Firefly?
Yeah. So the right answer is obvious. It's Star Wars. But I'm a bit old school as well. So I've never got over the Disney purchase and all of the old expanded universe books being turned into the Legends, because to me those are all still canon. Star Wars, but old school Star Wars.
Yeah, some of the coolest space fights I've read were in like Rogue Squadron.
Yeah.
I was enthralled by those as a young man, reading those. And of course, as one does, you've got to do the hand motions, like the plane flying as you're reading it to visualize it. Because who doesn't do that?
Yeah.
Did you have a favorite Legends book that you read, or canon for us to know?
Well, the thing with Legends is there are so many of them, so I haven't read all of them or anywhere near close. But a few of them, because there are a few of them that I remember having as a kid, so I just read them over and over again. So one of them was Darksaber, which that was essentially the Empire was building a new Death Star, but if I remember correctly, they were kind of in league with the Hutts as well, which was quite interesting. I like that one. There was the Han Solo prequel trilogy that started with the Paradise Snare. So I really like that one. And then there was a couple of ones focused on the bounty hunters. And there was one in particular, the Mandalorian armor, which was the story of how Boba Fett got his armor. Again, of course, that totally doesn't work with what we know now. But back then at the time, it was really interesting to kind of get that glimpse into, obviously, Boba Fett, a fan favorite. And before, even before the prequel movies, sort of at the tail end of the 90s, there was like a dearth of information about who Boba Fett really was. And so it was kind of cool to read about it,
Absolutely. I enjoyed all of it, but I also liked that the world felt more lived in. Like I don't
Mhm.
have a problem necessarily with Star Trek. I thought it felt a little too utopian in some ways from the original stuff, and and everything felt a little too sterile sometimes. Some of the later series fixed a lot of that, but with Star Wars from the beginning, it felt like real.
Yeah.
And one of the things, like for instance, I don't know if you've ever been to a desert, but when you see movies set in the desert and everything's clean and everyone's clean, I'm like, no, sand gets everywhere.
Yeah.
And on Tatooine, they actually kind of showed that.
Yeah.
They forgot it in some of the later Disney shows because then everything's clean again. But like if you're out in nature, it should be dirty and smelly, and just the way it is.
It's interesting because I watched on YouTube the other day. It was an interview with one of the Monty Python team. Again, big British piece of legacy there. But they were talking about all of the movies they did, but I think it was particularly the Holy Grail they were talking about, and they were saying how they'd gone out of their way to make kind of medieval life feel like dirty and smelly and unclean, and like apparently like all of the extras they had like they painted like yellow teeth on them and like blacked out some of their teeth and stuff to make it feel more medieval. And they were actually saying it turns out probably in medieval times, it probably wasn't actually like that because this was before like sugar was being imported. So actually they had okay teeth because they weren't eating loads of sugary products. But it's just what we expect as modern readers and modern viewers. We expect like medieval times to be dirty and smelly. And I'm sure you're going to get onto this later, but it's also what, grimdark fantasy does really well of making that, of making sort of fantastical middle age like villages and cities actually feel gross and dirty and like there's illness everywhere and plague rats and all of this stuff, which you don't get as much in something like traditional epic fantasy like Lord of the Rings.
So they would have had better teeth than we give them credit for. You're right, because of the lack of sugar in their diet for the most part. They had more issues with grinding stuff because they were biting into stuff that was hard if they didn't properly mill the wheat or whatever. And they had other issues, but they could brush their teeth. They used, I think, mint twigs is how they would do it, and they just rub that on their teeth. There's a couple of YouTube channels, if you're a history nerd, that it's called Living History, and basically they try to recreate historical eras by experiencing it physically. So they'll sleep for a week in one of the cabins, tents, castles, whatever, and they kind of try to experience it as it would have been to the greatest degree possible. You can get your teeth pretty clean when you do it that way. But there would have been other issues that, health-wise and smell-wise. I mean, you get nose blind to it, so it probably didn't smell to them, but they definitely weren't showering on a regular basis. So that part is true. Dirty clothes, absolutely true. Threadbare, I mean, they didn't waste anything. They would wear it till the wheels, till it fell apart, really. That's where the myth of everyone was shorter or skinnier back in the day. Not to say they weren't to a degree based on modernity, but some of that is just only the extremes of sizing. Because I'm a history nerd. Only the extremes of sizing survive. Like when you find, this wardrobe and this one outfit from 1,000 years ago. Well, that's just because anybody that was the normal size, their stuff didn't get saved because it was worn till till it fell apart. Then it was used as rags, and then it was used as fire starter.
Yeah.
So it's interesting, like what we think we know and what we know. There's a whole study of history called historiography, the history of history, that all history majors have to take that goes into all of this. Probably way more than you wanted, though.
No, awesome. That's cool stuff.
That's one of the things that that's fascinating. Like if you want to study ancient and medieval, though, you kind of have to go to Europe because all of your buildings are like ancient. Like you grow up around that, whereas for us, it's still over here in the U.S. A lot of that's exotic.
Yeah.
Like not to say we didn't have stuff going on here, but most of it wasn't like building castles and like remnants that remain to a large degree visible and used.
Yeah. Yeah, and we have loads of them. I mean, it's kind of one of those things whenever I go on like a vacation or with family or whatever, usually at least once there's a town or a village with a castle in it that we explore. So it's kind of one of those things that you do as on a vacation in the UK is wherever you go, you end up going to a castle because there are so many of them.
And the idea that people are still sleeping and literally like continuously living in buildings built 1,000 years ago baffles my mind. And part of the reason you did build in stone was because there wasn't as much wood. So you it makes sense, but it definitely leaves a legacy and a mark on the land, which is just kind of cool. So,
yeah.
All right. So speaking of fantasy, since you mentioned it, we are polytheistic here at the Blasters and Blades podcast. So Game of Thrones, Wheel of Time, or Chronicles of Narnia?
Yeah. Well, I must admit, and this is heresy, I haven't read any of the Wheel of Time books yet. And the reason being is because I know that there's I think it's 13 of them, isn't there? So I know as soon as I start reading, I'm going to feel compelled to keep on going through the series. And that's like a year's worth of reading right there. So I keep putting it off. But yeah, I've read the Narnia books, and I've read the Game of Thrones books. I'd have to go with Game of Thrones. And obviously, the ones we haven't mentioned, Lord of the Rings books are great reads as well. I've read a few of the Forgotten Realms books as well, because back in the day, I used to play Dungeons and Dragons, and I'm a big fan of Baldur's Gate and Icewind Dale and the games that are set in the Forgotten Realms series. I've also read, well, I'm currently playing for the first time. I'm playing Witcher 3 on my Nintendo Switch that my partner got for my birthday. Because I haven't played any of the Witcher games. And I didn't really like the TV show very much, but I have read and enjoyed all of the books. So it's been really interesting for me to go from in the Witcher kind of series, from going from having read the books to now actually sort of playing the games rather than the other way around. So I'd have to say they're up there as well for me in terms of sort of fantasy reads.
Okay, Lord of the Rings is a classic. We actually stopped including it because everyone just said it, so it just kind of wasn't fair. Although, given that you write horror and mystery, I thought you'd go for Game of Thrones.
Well, Game of Thrones is definitely up there. It's hard to judge it, though, isn't it? Because obviously it's an incomplete series. And even though I did purposefully, when it was the big cultural phenomenon, I was deliberately reading the books first, then watching the show, then reading the next book, watching the show. But obviously by the time I got to the end of the books and just watched the rest of the show. So it's actually hard for me to now. Mind you, I suppose the same is sort of true with Lord of the Rings, where whenever I think of it, I probably think of it more as the movie than as the books, even though I've read the books a fair few times. So, but yeah, I mean, I think the good thing with any fantasy has usually got elements of horror to it. I mean, the Nazgul in Lord of the Rings are great horror characters. So, I think it's funny we mentioned romance earlier, and I went to a convention probably about 10, 15 years ago now, where one of the speakers said that horror and romance are really the only two genres that can creep into a different genre without overtaking it. So let's say, you're writing a mystery. As soon as you put fantasy elements in it, it becomes like a fantasy mystery. Whereas if you put horror elements into it, it can still stay like a pure mystery. And I think Lord of the Rings is a great example of that, where it has horror elements to it, but it's still very much fantasy.
Yeah, although sometimes, at least when it comes to historical fantasy, where they do Second World, it's medieval-esque, you'll get those people be like, "That's not what really happened," and I'm just they can't forget that the history is set in a fake world. So of course it's not what happened. It's fantasy. It's make believe. I've seen some of the book reviews slam historical fantasy romance novels for not being true.
Yeah,
just the magic didn't give it away. I don't know what you want from me, people.
Yeah, but reviewers are weird in the nicest way possible. Some of them are absolutely unhinged. So, I mean, you can see if you just look up your favorite book or look up a classic, look up Lord of the Rings, or, I don't know, some Dickens or whatever, and look at the 1-star reviews, and there'll always be really weird people posting reviews. Although I do have to say, one that made me laugh, I can't remember which book, but somebody reviewed one of the Jane Austen novels and gave it 1 star and said it's just people going to other people's houses, which I thought was hilarious.
That's actually not wrong, though.
No, they have a point, but I'm not a Jane Austen fan, so I'm bound to agree.
So I did a quick look. The Wheel of Time is 15 books. So for people that want to correct us with actually, we self-corrected. There you go. I don't know. The reviews are weird. Sometimes they're in good faith. I've seen reviews that made me want to buy books. Like a Mill Sci-Fi in the review is too much cussing and too much violence, and I'm like, yes, please. Whereas in some of it, it's unhinged. The iconic book review where it's like, this is not the 13 Jimmy Dean sausages I ordered. For a physical copy of a book. Those just amuse me. And if you ever, as an author, want to feel better about your writing, go look at some of the pros that are making lots of money at it. Read their 1 stars, and you realize, okay, maybe you're not as bad as you thought.
Exactly. Yeah.
Although, like you said, some of them are unhinged. And if you follow their account, like you can do on Amazon, you click the reviewer, and then you see like literally everything is a 1-star review for them. And you're like, oh,
Yeah.
okay, they're just bitter betties. But that's the important part to your listener to remember as you write reviews. You're writing for other readers, other consumers, and so their opinion is valid, even if we think it's ludicrous.
Exactly, yeah. And as you say, like even the very like there was a review I got which was a 3-star review that just said, I'm hoping to read this soon. And I was like looking at it and I was like, why did you give me 3 stars? Because that like dragged my average down. But again, it's kind of like the reviews aren't for the author, so I can't vouch for other authors, but certainly I tend to read them all. But it's not. It's not. I don't get upset by a bad review, or I don't get too much of an ego boost by a good review, because again, they're not actually for me. I'm just sort of. It's like listening in on a conversation to see if there's anything I can take away to improve. But at the end of the day, I'm not supposed to be a part of that conversation. So
Yeah, it's sometimes when readers are reviewing, and we did a whole podcast episode where we talked about the value of reviews, but sometimes readers can pinpoint a problem, something didn't work for them, and they don't always articulate why, because they don't, they're not understanding the story structure in a way where they're using the words we would use. So, sometimes if it didn't click, maybe it's because you didn't describe the motive enough or whatever. They're telling you the symptom and not the cause, and it's easy to get that mixed up. Which is, like I said, it's valid. But I also write reviews as a reader, and so they can be a fun way to sort of dive into what makes people tick and why we like what we like.
Yeah.
Although my reviews over at Upstream Reviews more in line with what I might have written as an English major, with just more normal writing instead of the stilted academic prose. So yeah, it's whereas Amazon, Barnes and Noble, those tend to be more bullet points people write, because they're either writing on their phone or their tablet, or they're in a hurry and they're like, okay. My favorite ones are when they run out of words, but it's not long enough, so they put now I'm writing because they won't let me post it yet or stuff.
Yeah.
I'm like, well, at least they wrote something.
Yeah, that's it. Well, and again, it's one of those things where, I'm, as an author, I'm grateful for every review I get, whether it's bad or good, or with the exception of that 3-star from the person who hadn't actually read it, because the important thing is that they're reading it, as opposed to, and the fact that they've taken some time to actually share their feedback kind of means a lot, whether that's positive or negative feedback. Because again, everyone's entitled to their opinion, and you can't please everybody.
Absolutely. And so for me, I actually wish we could use some of them as ad copy. Like my favorite was a 1-star review for my very first military sci-fi series, the book 1. And it was like, this is what happens when a 12-year-old with ADHD writes gun porn. And I'm like, dude, that's like, I should put that on a t-shirt. What are you talking about?
Yeah.
Unfortunately, Amazon will go through and purge reviews periodically for reasons unbeknown to anybody.
Yeah.
And that was one of the ones that didn't survive the cut. But I'm like, that's the one I wanted to stick around, even if it was a 1-star.
Yeah.
So, all right. So one of the crying shames of adulthood is we stop asking each other the important questions. So thanks to our generous sponsors, we are bringing that back, and we're going to ask you, what is your favorite dinosaur, sir?
Oh, well, that's a good question. Well, I'm vegan, and I feel like it's that joke of how do you know if someone's vegan? They'll let you know. But I feel like because of that, I need to choose like a herbivorous dinosaur. I think generally my favorites are those, because I like the big dinosaurs, and generally the big dinosaurs were herbivorous because they were so big that they couldn't hunt anything down. They were too slow. But I quite liked the Stegosaurus, which I think was herbivorous, and the Diplodocus as well, because they have those like huge long necks.
What was the second one?
Diplodocus, or Diplodocus, as I used to say when I was a kid. I'm still not entirely sure what's the right way to say it.
Who knows? But I'm sure someone will correct us in the comments.
Yeah,
that's what they're good for. They actually, one of the jokes is you're supposed to misspell and use grammatical mistakes in a title, so everyone will come out of the woodwork for engagement.
That's clever. Yeah.
But then I'm like, well, if you're just doing a random stream, okay, I get maybe. But like, oh, if your career is words, maybe that's not a good look. So I don't. But yeah, the dinosaurs. That's a fun one. All right, and finally, we are civilized human beings here at the Blasters and Blades podcast. We are no longer knuckle dragging troglodytes. So, coffee or tea, and how do you take it?
Yeah, well, we mentioned before we started that the British are known for being a nation of tea lovers. And I like tea. It's okay, but I definitely drink a lot more coffee. For me,
You're
again,
an honorary American. We accept you.
Great. Well, I'll normally go for like a latte with oat milk or soy milk or something like that, and I'm perfectly happy with that. I make a fair amount at home where I'll just make it just like a white coffee, and then the same with my tea really. So it'll just be tea, no sugars, and a bit of soy milk or oat milk. So, but I drink tea a lot less. But these days, it actually makes it for like coffee is like what I drink to survive and actually make sure I make sense when I get out of bed in the morning. Tea is like every now and then I'll be like, you know what, I fancy a cup of tea, and it's just like it's almost like a treat rather than a necessity, I suppose.
So when I was in the Army, we did when I was serving overseas, we actually worked with some British units. In fact, there was a young private Handley in the British Army who I didn't know, but because we had the same last name and he liked the 101st on my shoulder as my unit patch, we traded blouses. So I still have his and he has mine somewhere. But that was one of the things when we were working with them that was weird. Like it was like 130 degrees and in the middle of a desert, they're stopping for tea at noon.
Yeah.
Like, don't you know you should be drinking something cold? Although they swear the hot beverage actually will cool you down more than the cold water.
Yeah.
I was never convinced. But yeah. There's a funny video going around on the 4th of July, and it's a couple years old at this point, at least before the Queen passed, because it was, that was in the video. There's some tanker showing one of the built into your tank is like a tea brewing station or whatever.
Yeah.
They're mocking us with the video, and I was absolutely here for it. The British Tank Corps, whatever that was.
I think I remember that, yeah.
Yeah, it floats around every year, and I'm one of the ones who will share it every year.
Yeah.
Just because it's hilarious. But yeah, they definitely take it seriously. And if you want to hear a British take on all things military, dear listener, I recommend a podcast. It's called Tea and Medals. And it's a former British military guy who got some medals for heroism. And I'm not familiar with all of like the medals, the way the Brits do it, because there's a lot more. And some of them it's regimentally based. But he interviews people that get all these medals. And that's one of the opening questions is how do they take their tea? And then they sit drinking tea as they talk about their combat experience. And it's weird because they're talking about all this graphic stuff, and given like the era I served, it's a lot of foul letters. And then these people are sounding all posh and proper as they talk about doing the same things with no cuss words. And I'm like, are we sure they're in the military? If you haven't checked it out and you're interested in military history, people, check it out. It's worth your time. Awesome. All right. So how did you get into, well, first with reading, because obviously, you don't start writing if you're not a reader.
Yeah, well, reading for me is always it's always been a big part of my life. I mean, I was quite a bookish kid. I mean, I even remember at secondary school, they in English, they wanted us to write these little book reviews after every book that we read. And they'd give us out this like a sort of half a sheet of paper kind of thing with some questions on it and all of that. And the teacher actually told me I could stop doing them because I was having to like do like 10 a week or something ridiculous because of how many books I was reading. And it was like everyone else was doing 1 or 2 a month, so it wasn't too bad for them. But yeah, I mean, I just sort of grew up with a book in my hand. I mean, some of my earliest memories are of going to the library. I had a lot of sort of secondhand books as well, and used to read things like the Goosebumps series. There's a series called Horrible Histories, which as a history fan you should check out if you haven't come across. They're very British. So Goosebumps I know has kind of made it around the world, but Horrible Histories never seem to leave the UK. But basically it's like a humorous take on history, but it covers a lot of like the gorier stuff, but in a way that's designed for kids. So it will tell you exactly, what a guillotine was and how they were used and all of this stuff, but it's written for kids still with like lots of cartoons and stuff like that. So I read those a lot. And yeah, I mean, some of my favorite memories as a kid were actually being off school sick, because then I would usually end up like curled up on the sofa under a blanket with, one of my parents taking care of me all day, and I'll just lie there and read books all day. So, yeah, it's just always been a thing that I've been sort of passionate about.
Did you ever get in trouble for like hiding a book you were reading behind your textbook when you should have been doing school?
Well, funnily enough, I didn't get in trouble for that as much. But what did happen was whenever we had like a book that we were studying in English, you would the way they would do it is you just go around the class and like they'd pick a page, like they'd pick a student and they'd read one page and pick another student, and so it was like almost like creating this like like almost doing an audio book in real time or whatever. But that meant it took forever to read the books, so I used to just read ahead of where we were. And then usually by the time we were about, a quarter of the way through the book, reading it out in class, I'd already finished it. But I would get in trouble because they'd think I wasn't paying attention when they picked me to read the next page, when actually it was just that I was 150 pages further on. And I had to like nudge somebody and say, what page are you guys on? So I could go back and kind of pick it up. But also I did get in trouble a few times for basically for spoilers, because the kids in the class they'd get into what we were reading at last and they'd be like, oh, well, what happens to so and so? And I'd be like, well, this happens, then that happens, then this happens, and I'd sort of tell them the plot. So I got in trouble for that.
So no spoilers from you anymore. You learned your lesson.
Yeah, well, I try and avoid spoilers, but I mean, it's one of those things. I think sometimes they happen accidentally as well. So I try and avoid them if I know, or also if I'm talking to somebody about something and I'll kind of ask them, I'll be like, do you want spoilers or not? And, I do it with my girlfriend quite a lot because I'll be talking to her about whatever I'm reading and I'll be like, are you likely to read this book? Because if not, I can tell you all of what happens. But if you are, obviously, I'll save it. So, I try and be a little bit more considerate there, but also, I've never been one of the kinds of readers the other way around where spoilers don't really bother me. I don't mind. Like even again with mystery is a great example. I'll quite happily reread, Death on the Nile by Agatha Christie, which is one of my favorites. Even though I know exactly who did it and why they did it. For me, it's like the pleasure of the journey almost as much as the destination. Whereas I know a lot of people who they just wouldn't be able to read a mystery book if they knew how it was going to end.
Yeah, I'm the weirdo. The few times I read mysteries, and I generally don't like to, but when I do, I will cheat and I will read the ending first.
Yeah.
And spoilers don't bother me. I joke that it's because of the head injury. Like I'll forget by the time we get there anyway. But in realistic, like I just don't care in general. Because for me, someone else's interpretation isn't always mine, and I picture things in my head like a movie when I read, so I don't always picture it the same way. Which can lead to some interesting like misunderstandings. So have you read any of the Shannara Chronicles?
I haven't, no. I've come across them. I think my dad read them because he was a big sort of sci-fi and fantasy reader, but I haven't read any of them.
So one of the things is a setting is supposed to be like post-apocalyptic Earth. And I missed that. I just, took it as a standard fantasy place. In some of the places in fantasy lands are going to be decrepit or whatever. Yeah. Until I watched the Shannara Chronicles TV show that got one season, and I wish it had gotten more. And they showed like an aircraft carrier lying on its side, and I'm like, this wasn't post-apoc. And so I did a quick Google search. I'm like, oh crap, I missed it.
Yeah.
So one of the things that sets readers of a certain generation apart, at least in the US, is the reading encouragement programs. So like here we had the Pizza Hut, where if you get X number of reading and you have to get a stamp from your librarian for every book you read, you would get a free personal pan pizza at Pizza Hut. And the gimmick was, of course, once you get there for your little free personal pan pizza, the rest of the family buys stuff too, right? Because you're celebrating your kid. So it was a marketing like loss leader, essentially. Did they do programs like that over there in the UK?
Nothing specific I can remember, but I think everyone of my generation in the UK will remember that it was the Scholastic book fairs. So
I had those too.
Yeah. So those were a huge thing, and you'd know they were coming up at school, and you'd save up your pocket money and ask your parents for some money for a book and things. So those are kind of the biggest things that I remember. And then it was sort of after my time, but they did similar things, but World Book Day as well. So with everybody kind of dressing up as a character from books. I don't remember doing those so much, but I do remember doing a lot of like, there'd be like, a Roman themed day or a Viking themed day, and everyone would dress up for that. And then they'd have like an expert come in and that was, I suppose, more about history. But again, I was reading a lot of those horrible histories books. So a lot of my reading was like, and even with Goosebumps, like one of my favorite Goosebumps books was I can't remember the specific name of it now, but it was set in the Tower of London or an equivalent of the Tower of London. So I did always like that kind of I suppose like yourself, when history kind of came into whatever I was reading.
Okay. Yeah, we didn't have like the World Book Day. I just remember the Scholastic Book Fairs too in elementary school, and you get so excited, and you get that cheap, super thin paper that the ads came on, where they'd send it in advance, so you could kind of pick what you were going to buy. And like trying to do the math in your head of like, if I do this book instead of this book, I can get 2 more books, and you're like doing these complex equations to figure out how to get the most for your money.
Yeah.
That's that old, I've seen the memes floating around where like, I want someone to look at me with as much excitement as kids looked at the Scholastic Book Fair advert.
Yeah. It's funny because even the kids that weren't huge readers were encouraged by it. So I think that's definitely like, it shows it was a good thing. It was because kids like me, I mean, with or without it, I was going to be reading loads of books anyway. I would just, would have gone to the library or something, but it was great that it actually got the ones who didn't read as much, and it got those interested.
And it also made reading somewhat of a social thing, because now you can talk with your friends about which book you're going to get instead of being that weird kid who's always reading. Like now it's just kind of acceptable. And so are you old, like when you grew up reading, I don't know how old you are, were you reading all like old Dewey Decimal System, paperback, print, whatever, or did you have the e-readers yet?
Yeah, I was print and sort of still am. I mean, I would say like I'm an elder millennial. So I finished secondary school in 2005.
Okay.
And yeah, I've just never been one for e-readers in general. I always prefer to get the paperbacks where I can. But originally, it was because I used to keep all of the books that I read, but it got to the point where I had too many books. I know they say there's no such thing, but there definitely was, because it was getting hard to move around in the house. So, so yeah. But these days, I still go for the paperback, just because again, I prefer the format. I like the feel of it. Paperbacks and ebooks, really. Audiobooks.
Yeah, I do audiobooks because listening with my ears is easier on the head. Because the concentration to read print copies is the same I used to write, so it's like a balancing act. But one of the things kids these days will never understand is that hiding under the blanket when you're supposed to be asleep with a flashlight or the torch, like sweating your butt off as you're reading when you're supposed to be asleep because you got to know what happens next, and hoping your parents don't catch you. Knowing, and as an adult, I'm like, my parents totally knew we were doing it, but we were reading, so they were just cool with it.
Yeah.
And they won't understand that because now the e-readers are all backlit, and it's not the same. And then the other part they'll never understand is like when you get to a point where you've read every book in the genre you like in your library, so you have to go outside of your comfort zone. And, if you're a sci-fi reader, you'll read the fantasy or the mystery or the horror or whatever. But now that everything's digital and you can narrow your niche, so there are people that will never leave that niche. They only read, insert, narrow field, and people are serving it. So they're getting their books, and they're not as widely read as they used to be, I think.
Yeah, no, I would agree with that. And again, it's one of those things where it has pros and cons. And also, both as a reader, as an author, obviously as a reader, it means you can read more of what you enjoy. But it does also mean you're not gonna broaden your mind as much. You're not going to potentially discover something that you might really like. And as an author, it's good in the sense that if you find your niche, and you've got readers, you've got your readers there who love that niche, they're going to read everything that you put out. But again, it does kind of artificially limit you, I guess. It can leave you kind of writing for the readers rather than for yourself.
Yeah, I'm lucky that Mill Sci-Fi is a broad enough audience. I don't have to stress as much as some of these people like the cozy mysteries or whatever, insert random. Although I think cozy mysteries is actually a growing subgenre.
It is, but then there's loads of really like specific subgenres beneath it as well. So like one of them is like food based. So like all of the books are like I don't know, meringues and murder or whatever. They're all like food themed in some way. And there's like pet based ones, so where the main guy's assistant is an animal. So there are like sort of niches within niches kind of thing, where if you go down enough, you you're kind of limited to how much you can do there.
See, I don't really get into like trigger warnings. I'm pretty hard to offend, I think, being growing up in the 80s and 90s, with Beavis and Butthead and all the other shows that were like so irreverent, Blazing Saddles and the like. I don't really need trigger warnings, but I definitely want to. This is going to be bad for your diet to read this book warnings, because some of those books get so into the food, and I'm like, oh, I know I just ate lunch, but I'm hungry again. How could you do this to me?
Yeah. Some of them even have recipes in them as well, so that it's like, here you can go and make what the detective had, or whatever recipe the killer used, or whatever it is.
I mean, it's genius marketing, but my diet, RIP. So that's the other thing is because I would read so quickly as a kid, like I would read the Encyclopedia Britannica or the dictionary or whatever, because I'd get bored and I'd read everything. So, you'd slip to the academic stuff too, just to fill the gap while you're waiting for that interlibrary loan book you got to come in,
Mm-hmm.
And I think people don't really get encyclopedias in print anymore. Like I remember every household had that Encyclopedia Britannica set.
Yeah. Well, they had door-to-door salesmen selling it, didn't they?
Yeah, they did. In fact, that's how we got ours. I think my older sister got our copy. I'm not sure what happened to it. I'm pretty sure she got it. But all righty. So this is the part, dear listener, we're going to pause for a moment and we're going to shamelessly chauffeur the man. And then we're going to come back and we're going to talk about the book that brought us here. So hold with us.
Well, hello, all you beautiful chicks and dudes of all sorts. This is Suave Rob Suarez, the bitchin' XX Daredevil star of Suave Rob's Amazing Ass-Saving Association, here with another ass-saving tip, totally free from me to you, to help you save your ass so you can live to sit another day. Now, back in the day, when dudes were dudes, this one dude, Benchmark Bob, buddy of mine, he had this little accident. He tried frying up an egg when he was totally hammered, so he washed a pan, then didn't dry it, then put a shitload of butter in it, then turned on the heat. Well, when you do that, chicks and dudes, the water makes the oil go splatzo all over your own personal face. And good old Benchmark got his bench marked, if you know what I mean. Like, when he took his apron away from his face, it looked less like a face and more like someone had stepped on a pepperoni pizza. I don't like to think about it. But that goes to show you, always dry your pans before you put oil in them, man. Especially if you're frying an egg. Want to know where I learned all this gonzo shit? I got it all done up pretty for you in Suave Rob's XX Daring Do, the first book of Suave Rob's Awesome Adventures by J. Daniel Sawyer. Come share the awesomeness with me, my brothers, 'cause you never know. The ass you save may be your own.
All right. Thank you for sticking with us through that commercial interlude. And it's kind of hard to top that. Dave Robertson does a fantastic job on the audiobook for that one. But we're going to give it a shot, and we're going to bring in Dane back to talk about the book that brought us here. So obviously the book in question, based on the episode, if you're listening or you read the title, is called Meat, Please, that you wrote. So what is the story? Like, how did you come up with the idea for this book?
Yeah, well, it started again with my sort of horror leaning, and I was just trying to think of what's the most unpleasant setting that you can think of to set a book in. And that's how I ended up on the idea of a factory farm, because I think everybody can agree, no matter what their diet preferences and all of that, everyone can agree factory farms aren't very nice places. And so that's sort of how it started out, and then I just sort of, I guess, what's the word? I worked backwards from that starting point and came up with my plot. It was kind of really interesting to build it out from there, because I had to make pretty much all of the characters in it are kind of morally gray, kind of. They're not bad people. They're not particularly good people. They're just people just trying to earn a living. And then I kind of started to think, well, what would happen if the tables were turned? And to begin with, we start out with humans ruling the facility, and then what would happen if the animals took over? So that was really the sort of the concept that I worked with, and just sort of went from there and let my imagination run wild.
Okay. Wasn't there a book? I seem to remember we read one in school about about an actual factory farm. I'm drawing a blank now on what that title was, but I seem to remember reading it. Were you inspired by some of that fiction that's out there?
To an extent. I mean, I think honestly, I was probably There are a few kind of key influences. One of them would be just anything Stephen King. This was my attempt at a sort of a Stephen King style book. And then zombie fiction kind of factors into it, because without being too much of a spoiler, it's just almost like zombie animals, essentially. So if you think, one thing in particular that did inspire me was, if you've ever seen the Resident Evil movies, in the very first one of those, there are the zombie dogs in that Mila Jovovich has to fight off, and those dogs scared me quite a lot when I was a kid. So I was kind of thinking, like, and imagine like something like a zombie cow. It might not be quick, but it would be relentless, kind of thing. And then alternative, like a flock of zombie chickens, for example. Again, one of them wouldn't be a threat. 10,000 of them all coming at you would definitely be a threat. So I think those were kind of the main influences there, really. But it's one of those. I mean, I think every author's kind of inspired by everything that's kind of come before them. So there are all kinds of all kinds of weird little influences that sort of went in there from various branches of fiction, I think. And that all kind of came together to make this composite whole. That it was a bit unwieldy as well to begin with. It took quite a lot of kind of hard work on the plotting side, and then a lot of editing as well, to make sure that I'd got it into something manageable.
Now, so first, the book I was thinking of was Upton Sinclair's The Jungle. Quick Google solved that one for me. So with this one, first, what would you rate it? If like parents are listening, is this okay for my kid? What would you like rate the book as far as age appropriateness?
Wow. I mean, if it was a movie, it would probably be a 15 or an 18 plus. Let's put it that way. It isn't certainly not one for younger kids. Just because there's some heavy language. There's some pretty brutal sort of gore scenes in there. But I mean, asking me to rate it is a bit tricky, because it's like, I mean, I remember I was sort of 13, 14 when I read the Hannibal books, for example. And I would say it's maybe on a par with the Hannibal books in terms of like how disturbing it is. And, but it's I don't think it's almost not my place to say like, this is how old you should be to read it. But definitely if I had like a 10-year-old kid, I wouldn't be giving them a copy if they said they wanted to read it. It's kind of up to them, but they're probably going to have nightmares.
So for point of contact, since we did talk, we were both history nerds, Hannibal Barker or Hannibal Lecter?
Oh, Hannibal Lecter. Yeah.
Okay. Different reasons to be sad when you read those.
Yeah, for sure.
Oh, Carthage, too soon. So is this a standalone novel? Will there be sequels?
It's interesting you asked that. I don't know if I've answered this question publicly before. It was conceived as a standalone. And sort of if you read it and you get to the end, you will sort of see it would be difficult to do a direct sequel to it. Certainly one that follows the same kind of cast of characters, but it could very easily have a sequel. Either like a sort of a sequel that just follows different people, or one where you sort of view what's happening from an outside point of view, because this is all basically in this one, everyone's trapped on the factory farm and they don't really know what's going on outside. Various reasons for that, like technology goes down and all of this stuff. So it's very kind of insular, like watching this this escape of all of the animals, and then like a disease outbreak, all from the inside, and they're all trapped. And again, another influence there would be something like Lord of the Flies, where true, it doesn't have, these horror elements, or again, these more sort of speculative elements, but it does have this very kind of human thing of what happens when you coop all of these people up and they can't get out. So there's easily, I could do another book in the same world that sort of looks at it from the outside perspective. My publisher for this it was originally self-published, and it got picked up by Genius Books, and they've kind of expressed interest, basically saying if you do a sequel, we would love to publish it. But also it was a big old project that it took a lot out of me to do as well. It's not like something like the mystery books that I write, where I can do those quite quickly and easily without a huge amount of research. With this, it took a lot of research, a lot of planning, and a lot of work. So yeah, it's definitely never say never, and I would love to do a sequel it just would be a lot of work. So we will see.
So you could potentially tell a story set in the world, but maybe not following these characters.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Right?
and again, building on what we said earlier about spoilers, I'm trying to go the appropriate level of spoileriness without giving too much away. But again, if you think of it as again, there is like a sort of a zombie influence to it, and if you think of something like a zombie outbreak, you could very easily tell the same story of like, we followed these, and this is what happened to these people from London. So let's see what happened to the people in Edinburgh, or let's see what happened in New York or whatever. So you can kind of start to sort of tell different stories based on the same kind of world events. It's almost similar to again, like anything post-apocalyptic, but I'm thinking like the big disaster movies. So something like if you've seen The Day After Tomorrow, great movie. I rewatched it recently actually, but that follows kind of again this huge global cataclysmic event, and it follows pretty much mostly what happens in New York City with a bit of elsewhere in the US. But you could quite easily have another film in that like series that would then look at, okay, well, what happened to Europe, or what happened in Asia, or what happened in Australia. So I think those big events, those big world changing events, lend themselves really nicely to having a series of that show how they impacted different parts of the world,
So an interconnected series of standalones.
Yeah. That's a good way of putting it. Yeah.
So one of the cool things, though, about the idea of a post-apoc or a zombie type of movie is you could bring those castles and suddenly they're cool again, right? You could live in those castles.
Yeah.
And if they're in a good enough state of repair, like okay, now the zombies can't get in because we got the walls between us.
Yeah, that's very true. Yeah, and I mean that's. I think in The Walking Dead, they had a season or two when they were in a prison, which is another great example of like this is actually it's almost purpose built for something like this.
Yeah, I was thinking about that. Is the prison like here in the U.S. we'd have to either build walls out of scrap or use fencing, yeah. Whereas you've got some existing walled cities that could be repurposed and repaired.
Yeah.
Although I don't know how many stonemasons exist in the world anymore.
No, that's true. It is a bit of a forgotten art.
So, although what's old is new again. When the need arises, you'll learn real quick.
Yeah.
The difference is now we've got books out there, and assuming the internet also doesn't go down, you could quickly, look that stuff up.
Yeah, that's very true.
So, when is your book set timeline wise?
Yeah, well, specifically, it doesn't explicitly say it. So in my head, it's kind of contemporary to as and when it got released / now. There was a mention of it. So because of the writing, it was going through pretty much its last batch of edits just when COVID hit, which actually worked in my favor slightly because then I worked in a few references to COVID because again, it's essentially what happens is there's like a lockdown / quarantine around the farm, and the military are brought in to make sure nothing enters or leaves this farm. And so I was kind of able to have a couple of throwaway references to COVID and what we'd learned from then, and how that's kind of then applied to the virus. So yeah, I would say now sort of early to mid 2020s is a good sort of time frame for it. Because there's nothing necessarily futuristic in terms of any of the technology used or anything like that. And again, I did very much want it to be today's approach to factory farming. The other thing, actually, there is a specific mention to the UK leaving the EU in there as well. So it's got to be post-Brexit. Not necessarily for a hugely political thing, but it made my life easier because, again, when I was doing all of my research for it, and maybe this is something we can probably talk about as well, but part of it was because I was vegetarian at the time, and my research then made me go vegan because I've read so much about a lot of the kind of processes that are used, and I wanted to kind of use all of the different horrific things that go on at a factory farm, plus add my own spin to it as well. So the fact that I kind of identified it as this is after the EU gave me a lot of leeway, because then it meant that I could do things that actually don't necessarily happen. So you wouldn't normally get a factory farm that has all of the different animals on it. Usually it would be a massive pig farm, but they wouldn't be doing chicken and sheep and, everything else. And then some of the sort of practices that are particularly barbaric would be like they're outlawed in the EU. But again, because of me setting it after the UK left the EU, then that allowed me to kind of directly address that in the plot and be like, well, now we're no longer covered by these laws. We can actually do this stuff. So, and again, it's very much a book of like three halves. So it's almost like Star Wars, actually, where you've got, the first one is sort of setting the scene. And actually it's very much like the evil that the man are doing to animals. So in this case, like the evil that the Empire is doing, and then the animals strike back and the animals take over. And this then goes into this Lord of the Flies scenario where they're all stuck together inside and the animals are taken over. And then the third act is kind of sort of what happens after that, after society is completely broken down, both inside and out. And you've only got a couple of survivors left through, disease, through to animal attacks, to goodness knows what else. And again, we were talking earlier about life in the Middle Ages. It pretty much goes back to that, because they get to a point where they've got no running water, so they're getting water from like catching it from when it rains. But one of the characters, for example, he has a dental abscess, so they've got like no real medicines. They've got a few bits that the vet's got on hand from what he uses to treat the animals, but they're basically having to pull this guy's tooth without anesthetic. So it's, again, that's a sort of a certain amount of horror by itself that just comes up by the situation, because they can't go to a dentist anymore. They don't have a dentist available. The nearest they've got, as I say, is the vet. So yeah, it was this. It's one of those where the scenario that they find themselves in actually allows you to create quite a lot of horror just because of the scenario.
Okay. Well, the reason I was asking about the era is, rather than pinpoint a specific date, is obviously things look different if you talk before the internet, before cell phones, right? Like mysteries, for instance, some of that stuff can't happen when you got the internet, like some of the mystery plot points, or the reason in some plots why you isolate people, right? To limit contact with the outside world and confine the story. So would you say this is... leans more into the horror or the post-apoc or the zombie, or is it sort of equally balanced?
I would say probably pretty equally balanced. And again, there's that kind of 3-act thing as well, which which kind of helps. So definitely the third act is probably the most post-apocalyptic. The second act is the most sort of zombie, and the first act is the most horror, especially in terms of what I love about horror is the horror that human beings can do. So there is like a little bit of a supernatural element to one of the subplots, but mostly it is just like this is the everyday, the kind of the everyday evil, to the point at which you don't even realize it's evil anymore. And I just wanted to build on your previous point as well about the internet. So I actually got around that by they're deliberately, the facility is in basically a bit of a dead zone where it's got really bad signal. And then when the army comes in, they're kind of cutting off the outside lines of communication in terms of the physical phone lines and the power and things like that as well. And part of that was a deliberate thing to kind of force them to be, it was to kind of force that isolation. There's really no point at which having an internet connection or something like that would really help them that much. But not having that outside communication, or having very limited outside communication, that helps to kind of build on that isolation, which again is just that kind of horror of like, we're all stuck here. There's nothing we can do. We can't get out kind of thing.
So is there a specific villain, or is it just humanity in general that's the villain in this story?
Yeah, there are various different villains. There's no kind of main overall villain. There is one animal. Well, there are I guess two animals that are like the main animal villains. One of them he's just called the Bull, and he is like their main big breeding bull that they used. And when he gets out, obviously he's the biggest of all of the cows, so you don't want to be chased by him because he'll go through a wall, but then also from a human point of view, I mean, it begins with, it's almost like the CEO of the factory farm is kind of the bad guy because he's the guy running the show, but again, it's very morally grey, and he's at the end of the day he's doing it because it's his job. And then once they all get stuck inside, it's kind of there's one of the workers becomes kind of the big antagonist, because you get this kind of two different groups who both think that they should be doing different things. So like, should we be rationing? Should we, just say screw it and just eat what we've got now because we're all hungry and we might be dead tomorrow anyway? And so there's the two different groups, and the leader of the group that opposes the CEO, he kind of then becomes the de facto antagonist as well. And so it's one of those where there's sort of shifting bad guys. I would say throughout there are generally two main good guys. One of them is the facility's vet, who's only there because he had a scandal at his like little small town vet practice. So this was the only job he could get, and he kind of hates it because he's really all he's doing is keeping the animals alive long enough for them to be slaughtered and sent off to meat packing. And then there is the work experience girl, who is basically pretty much as innocent as the characters get. She's only been there a couple of months. She's just doing it because her uncle is the CEO, and she ends up getting trapped in there with all of these sort of like foul-mouthed, middle-aged dudes who have, been working on the factory farm production lines for years. So those are kind of the two good guys, and then it's just a sort of the range of factors working against them, really.
So let's talk about the good guys then. Who are the main characters in this story?
So yeah, you've got Tom Copeland, who is the vet I mentioned, and then Jill McDonald, who is the owner's daughter. I had to call the owner McDonald, by the way, so he because it's old MacDonald had a farm, and also it ties in with McDonald's as well, so it was like the perfect name. But yeah, those are like the two main kind of quote unquote good guy characters. And one of the challenges that I had with it is that I wanted it to be quite broad. So I almost was inspired by something like Stephen King's Under the Dome, which again, that's like the plot of that is this big dome comes down over this small town and everyone's stuck inside it. And you're kind of following like 20, 30 different people who live in this town. So I wanted to sort of follow all of the different people who were working at the factory farm in the various different roles. And so I have there's even at the end of the book, there's almost like a cast of characters kind of thing. So that was one of the challenges of writing it, that there were 30, 40 main characters who all have to feel as though they have a purpose there. So yeah, I don't want to go through all of them. Another favorite though is Jim. So Big Jim, he's called, and he's a Scottish guy, and he's like their head of security. So again, he plays a pretty big role once they're kind of self-imposed. They all end up inside basically, and he kind of plays a pretty big role trying to keep the peace there. But there's only so much one man can do. And then yeah, Lee Keyes is the guy who's kind of the head of the kind of the anti John McDonald movement. So he's the guy who's like saying, no, actually, I want to eat all of our supplies now, and kind of leading the internal kind of rebellion. There are also other guys. There's a guy called Ben Runciman who is he's in the British Army, so he's kind of he's the person that they speak to from the outside when this kind of sort of cordon is being put in around the facility to try and make sure nothing enters and nothing leaves. And then there is a protester and his family as well, and there are understandable tensions that happen when the protester ends up inside with the factory farm lot, and he's stuck in there with them as well. So yeah, there's kind of a bunch of different characters, all with different motives and different reasons for being there.
Do they get resolution at the end of the story, or is it a cliffhanger?
There is sort of both. Most of the characters get resolution. There is essentially, it's almost like going back to Agatha Christie influence, sort of like, and then there were none, where throughout they're just kind of getting whittled down until there aren't many of them left. And then it almost comes full circle. And then I don't want to give away the absolute ending. It's a cliffhanger in terms of you don't know what happens next, but let's just say that it's not looking good for the ones that survive. That's sort of the point at which they realize, actually, this thing is bigger than just us. what's the good of escaping from the complex if you find out that, you know, life hasn't gone on outside of it, and you know, you've almost gone out of the frying pan into the fire, so to speak.
So, what kind of research did you have to do for this novel?
Lots. It was actually the most research I've ever done for a novel. So, and again, this is why I ended up going vegan, was because I did a lot of research into the production of everything I could think of, from, you know, from just beef production through to, okay, well, like, how about foie gras, for example? Like even like duck farming, things like that you don't necessarily think of when you think of factory farming. So a lot of that stuff, and again, a lot of that was watching documentaries, reading books, a lot of like, you know, the pretty grim animal rights activist footage where they've got into a factory farm and recorded footage and all of this stuff. There was also a lot of stuff, pretty much anything zombie related I could get my hands on, anything end of the world related, anything isolation based, because again, I wanted to kind of cover that human sort of psychology of what happens when people are all stuck together. I spoke to a friend of mine, actually, called Pembroke Sinclair, who's written a bunch of zombie novels, but she's also written a non-fiction book, which is about the research that she did. And she went into like water refineries to speak to people there, and to get them to explain, okay, if there was a waterborne zombie virus that got into the water, how long until everyone got infected? And like, she'd go in and ask them these kind of questions, and then she'd written about this in her book. So I read that and then spoke to her and asked her a few follow-up questions as well. So yeah, there was a lot, and even like from the protester side of things and from the British Army side of things, a lot of research into, okay, well, what would they actually do in this scenario? So like, from the protesters, what's their modus operandi? Like, what would they do? And, you know, would they be just sitting outside and, you know, trying to blockade traffic? Would they actually be trying to, you know, cut the wires and get inside and to rescue the animals? What would they attempt to do? And even like the British Army, like at what point would they be authorized to shoot on sight if they saw somebody trying to break through this thing? Bearing in mind, again, once they know the reality of this virus that's happening. And a lot of it's actually interesting when COVID came along, because another one of the ideas that kind of came from it is people have been saying for decades and decades that there's going to be another big pandemic soon. It happens every 100 years or so. And the last one was the Spanish flu. So we were about due. But people were also saying the chances are the next big pandemic, it will be something like bird flu or swine flu, and it will originate in a factory farm, because it's just having that many animals together in such close proximity is like perfect breeding grounds for some new disease. So a lot of, again, research into that and like what causes pandemics and what's the government response to it. And again, then COVID helped a lot with that as well. So, you know, it's funny. I read Station 11, I think, by Emily St. John Mandel, and in that there's a pandemic happening and people panic buy toilet roll. And she wrote that before COVID, and I happened to be reading it after COVID, and I was like, wow, she did like a really good job of, again, predicting this is what human beings would do. They'd panic and buy lots of toilet roll, because apparently that's where their priorities lie. So yeah, there was a lot of kind of seeing what else was on the market and how other people had approached these kind of situations.
Yeah, I never understood the panic buying of toilet paper. Everything else made sense, right? If you're going to prepare for whatever. I mean, I live on the East Coast, hurricanes happen. So in general, we just stay prepared. Yeah. You know, you could lose power for weeks, but the toilet paper one, I could never make that one make sense.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, I didn't participate in it, but I could understand why people were doing it in a sense. Because also you got to think, and again, it goes back to the psychology of people when something like this happens. Like, it's the only thing they can do to feel as though they have a little bit of control. So that's sort of why they do it, really. And similar things happen again once all the characters meet, once they all get stuck inside this sort of this interior lockdown within the factory farm complex. There are only certain things they can control, and you know, one of them is like, well, we need some entertainment, so they organize basically like a bare knuckle boxing match, because it's like, it's something to do. That's the reason why they do it. There's no better reason than that, just that it is something to do, and it will diffuse some of the tensions, and actually, especially with, you know, a lot of this sort of adversarial stuff between the two groups, it can kind of resolve some of that tension as well, where actually it's like, actually probably all they need to do is just throw a few punches at each other and everybody will feel better. So yeah, it is interesting. Again, I think it is a control thing. People just want to control what they can control because they can't control the wider sort of situation in which they find themselves.
Okay, that makes sense. Although, like I said, the panic buying and the feeling of control I get, it's just toilet paper specifically that didn't make sense. But
yeah,
so your cover, in an age where everyone's got the computer-made covers that look very much, even when they're not AI, they have that look when you've got the artist rendering them. What made you go this route with your cover? I mean, it definitely looks like a painting. It gets across the darkness with the coloring. But what made you make this visual decision?
Well, so this was essentially, as I say, I'd self-published first and done a cover there, which was sort of similar. It wasn't in terms of the style, wasn't similar, but it had like a bull's head, like the skull of a bull's head on it. And so this one was just because when I worked with Genius Books, they kind of gave me a range of cover design options, and we sort of worked together on it. This was actually their first time working with the guy who made this, and we just all sort of felt the guy who was making this was a pretty good fit for the kind of thing, you know, that would work for my book. And there are just, in my head, there are some rules that I have when it comes to cover design. So you mentioned that that idea of a lot of stuff looks like AI or very shiny, very over polished today. I'm not a fan of like realistic looking covers. So with my mysteries, for example, none of those, all of the covers on that are more about the setting rather than the characters. So I don't like it when a book has a character on the front cover, whether it's a realistic design, whether it's a cartoon, whatever it is, because I'm like you, I kind of imagine a book I'm reading as like a movie. So I want to kind of imagine it for myself. So I try and do the same thing with my covers, where I want a cover that captures the essence of the story without, you know, pre-programming into your head, this is what X character looks like. And I think a cover like this is a great way of doing that. You know, if we'd have gone for a very realistic looking bull to represent the bull in the story, then that's how the reader would imagine it. And I want them to come up with their own imagination, especially because it's that idea of, if you don't see something, actually what you imagine is probably worse than what it really is like. And that's what a lot of horror movies these days are realizing, where it's like, actually not showing the movie makes the monster, not showing the monster actually makes it scarier than showing it, but using loads of CGI and it not quite looking right. So yeah, that's probably like the main inspiration behind it.
Okay. With the sequels, if you decide to go that route, you think you'd go for a similar vibe for the cover? I mean, I definitely think it speaks to what you've described as far as a cover. It nailed it. I mean, it looks, on the one hand, it looks less professional, but on the other, that sells the image because it's not overly polished. And I don't mean less professional. Maybe less polished is the right wording, because it definitely looks like it shows the darkness you've described, right? Like as far as the image goes, and then the clarity of the animal's eyes kind of, you know, makes you wonder like what's going on with these animals. So I'm a fan of the cover. It wouldn't have been what I would have made the choice of, but I think it fits with what you've described so perfectly. I don't know that you could have gone any other way. Yeah.
Well, that's it. And it is one of those where cover design is always tricky because there are so many different directions you can go in. And so I normally, again, I'll find a designer I'm happy with and where I like their work. And then I'll kind of give them a bit of carte blanche to approach it. And then it kind of builds from there, really. I think if I were to do more in the series, I'd probably just work with the same person, because I think, again, it would help to make it feel more like a series to have a similar style throughout anyway. And also it does reflect, again, my own approach, really, because I would always say like perfect is the enemy of done, you know. So with editing, with proofreading and all of that, I try and, you know, polish it up as much as I can. But at the end of the day, it's never going to be 100% perfect, you know. And it's another thing with authors as well. We always think, you know, our best release is probably our last one, because you keep getting better and better over time. So yeah, I think I probably would just stick with and a similar style as well. So maybe it might even just be like a different animal or something like that. Just to keep that going. And I've done similar with my mystery series where, again, that is kind of like glossier, more. A lot of those are sort of like cityscapes. So it'll be like London in the dark, or it'll be a police vehicle, in the rain with it being reflected off the puddles and things like that. And they've all kind of got a similar feel. And again, I've been lucky anyway. So all of my books in that series, the cover design has been the same for each of them. And then all of my ones that have all been self-published, I've used the same cover designer, I think, for all of those, certainly for most of them. So again, just having the same person works on it, I think does create a kind of feeling that they belong together as well. So yeah.
So do you have a favorite character in this story?
Yeah, it'd be Big Jim for me, for sure. I mean, he's just, as I say, is this sort of sweary, loudmouth Scottish guy who consistently made me laugh throughout, because he says all of the things that not only should like the characters not really say, people in general shouldn't say a lot of the stuff that he comes out with, but he comes out with it anyway because he just doesn't care. And he's got this. He's one of those people where there's so much to his background that there's like a lot of what would you call it? Like a lot of like blank spots in his history that you don't really know what he did, but you can imagine he was probably doing something really crazy. Like maybe like he was probably working on an oil rig for a bit, and then he probably did like private security in, Honduras for a while. And then he did a bit of this and a bit of that. He's probably did at least some time in jail, but he just hasn't mentioned it to anybody. He's just one of those sort of interesting characters, really. And probably the most fun to write. So yeah.
Did anything about the story as you were writing it surprise you? I don't know if you outline exclusively or if you go by the seat of your pants a little bit.
I am an outliner. I mean, I think there were definitely bits where I had to change it, and there were bits where my editor came up with suggestions. Just little ideas that came in that surprised me. I think one thing that did surprise me, there's a conversation between Tom Copeland, the vet, and Jill McDonald, the intern, at the very end, which I thought was, this bit was just something that kind of came out of nowhere, really, and that surprised me. And it's basically where they're talking about the future of the human race, and they have this like very frank conversation about what are we going to do? How are we going to make sure the race survives? And it doesn't pan out in the way that I think most people would expect it to pan out. And that kind of just wrote itself into the story. So there were little things like that definitely surprised me. Overall, though, again, I had planned out a lot of it. I think one of the things that did surprise me a bit was like how brutal parts of it got. There are bits of it that were difficult to write and that I know will be difficult for people to read because of just how like horrendous what's going on is. And that's totally okay with me. That was kind of what I was going for. It surprised me a bit how effective it was at times.
Okay, so this almost feels like you could take it and just plot wise, you could almost turn it into some sort of genetic mutation too, with the story. Was there anything, because obviously like we don't want spoilers, right? So is there anything about meat that we didn't ask that you think the readers should know before we wrap this up?
Nothing that I can think of. I mean, I think what I would say is, again, I mentioned that like, as I said, like doing the research on it is what turned me vegan. But it's the people that have read it. It's been read by people with all sorts of different like dietary preferences. And as I say, the thing is that most people agree that factory farms aren't very nice places. So it's not one of those books that's got like, it's designed to make you maybe think a bit more about where your food's coming from, but it's not going to say like you're eating wrong. You should be doing this. You should be doing that. So I think kind of go into it with an open mind and don't expect it to be preachy or anything like that, because it's not. That's not what it's about. But yes, I would certainly you probably don't read it just before eating, no matter what you're eating, whether you're eating, a beef burger or whether you're eating, tofu. It doesn't really matter, because either way, it's probably going to put you off your food. So, yeah, that's probably my words of warning there.
Okay, that's fair. So this is the part, dear listener, where I remind you to please be kind and speak your mind on the reviewing platforms. Your reviews help the right readers find the right books. So do your part. As we discussed earlier, they really do matter. And in this case, Dane really does read them. So if someone wanted to track you down on the internet, as one does, how would they find you?
Yeah, well, I'm easy to find if you just search Dane Cobain, Dane, and the surname is Cobain. There's only one of me, so you'll only find me. But yes, I have danecobain.com, which has got links to all of my various social medias, which again, I'm Dane Cobain on most of them. If you want to check out some books as well, I normally send people to Amazon. And if you just type in danecobain.com/Amazon, that will redirect you to Amazon, but also in your country, of the country that you live in, kind of thing. So if you're Canadian, you'll get .ca, and it just takes you to the easiest place to check out the books. And say hello.
All right, and you can find. What was that?
That was just some feedback. I don't know what just happened.
Okay. You can find us, dear listener, on our Linktree, linktr.ee, Linktree/Blasters and Blades Podcast. Again, Linktree/Blasters and Blades Podcast, where we link to all the things, the BitChute, the Rumbles, the YouTube, the TikToks, the Twitters, the Spotify, the Discord, the Blasters and Blades Facebook group and Facebook page. We have an email, blastersandbladespodcast@gmail.com. Again, blastersandbladespodcast@gmail.com, for professional purposes only, people. Save the shenanigans from Stabby Stab over there on the Instagram, Twitter, and the email. You can support the show by going to buymeacoffee.com/author J.R. Handley. Again, buymeacoffee.com/author J.R. Handley. Be sure to put in the comment section, it's for the podcast, and I promise I will keep my co-hosts duly caffeinated. They will drink that coffee brand coffee till it pours out of their eyeballs, and they'll swim away on a river of Java goodness. If you want some of that coffee brand coffee, link is in the show notes. Podcast Grunts is the code. You get 10% off. We get a little bit of a kickback. It's a win-win, people. And with that, I'd like to thank you for spending some of your precious time with us. For my crazy co-host, I am J.R. Handley, and this was the Blasters and Blades Podcast. We'll be back next week at the same time, where we'll indulge our love of nerd culture, cheesy jokes, and all things that go boom. All right, thanks for coming on, Dane. This was fun, and we'll have to have you back for some panels on horror and mystery and stuff.
Sounds good.
All right, and with that, we're going to hit the end button, people. Don't cuss yet. Wait for